How's it going, ladies and gentlemen? My name is Christian, and welcome to Liberty After Dark. Today, I wanted to take a little bit of time and do something that we haven't really done on the show in a long time, or on the channel, I guess, since this isn't the podcast proper. And that's that I wanted to take some content that somebody else had made, and I kind of want to give my 2 cents on it. Just throw my hat into the ring, per se. Unfortunately, this person is not here to defend their in this case, what'll be an analogy, but hopefully maybe one day we'll be able to have that conversation. And so we're going to be talking about an analogy proposed by a creator that some of you may know, named Vaush. I'll save you the time of me explaining the analogy, and I'll just go ahead and play the clip for you guys right now so you can hear it from him personally.
Right. You fly a plane, well, you're not flying. Plane crashes, desert island. You wake up, but somebody else, the only other survivor, woke up before you. And they have collected all the coconuts, the only food sources on the island. They have them. They're theirs now. And they say they'll provide you coconuts so long as you suck their dick. Now, the only question is, do you consider this a coercive exchange?
So I won't bore you by going through the example again. I feel like it's pretty straightforward. Is that an example of coercion? And I feel like this is really, it's an issue of definitions more than it is anything. And I'd encourage you guys to watch the rest of this debate. It's between Vaush and Bastiat on the Hippy Dippy Show, I believe is the name of the program. And this is supposed to be the debate of the year for them. And there's a whole judging thing at the end of it, and they pick a winner. It's fun. It's socialism versus capitalism. Go check it out. I'll leave a link in the description. However, I think this is a question that gets used by Vaush a lot against capitalists, and especially anarcho-capitalist types. Voluntarists would be included in that camp in this case. And it's a question that stumps a lot of people, and I think it does rightly so. I mean, it is sort of a bold-faced question, right? If you don't come in prepared for this sort of examination of your beliefs, or rather deconstruction, I don't think it's far off to suggest that this is something that could catch you up. So going into it, the question, is this an example of coercion, is essentially synonymous with, is this action immoral? Right? So what we're really asking is this immoral? And there's 2 ways to approach this. And I'll go ahead and I'll start from my own perspective, just because that's the one I'm most familiar with, but I'm also going to do my best to give a fair shake at Vaush's perspective so that we can try to juxtapose the 2 here. Again, if you want a more detailed explanation on Vaush's side, I would love for you to go ahead and watch the video. He does a pretty decent job of defending his claim here, essentially that the act would be immoral because it is coercion, right? So leaving the word coercion aside, let's just stick with immoral. I think it's completely synonymous here, like I said earlier. When someone is put into this position, what is being established is a hierarchy, one particularly of an access to scarce resources, right? There are only so many coconuts on this island. One person scooped them all up. You wake up a few hours later, desperate for a drink, and you can't get any unless you suck his dick. Now, it's silly and funny, I think, at the same time, but it's one of these situations where you have to answer the question. So personally, I would say no, it's not immoral for the person to ask for their dick to be sucked in exchange for the coconuts. Now, why is this? This is actually a really complex question to give a good answer to, which is why I think it's so good in these types of debates, because from a property rights perspective, you have to do a lot of establishing legwork, which I'm going to try to do my best job at here in a shorter time frame video than we usually do. It starts with a consideration of property rights. I use a system of property rights that can best be described as Lockean. And in this case, the person's acquiring of the coconuts would be making first use of them. And if you don't even include making first use, you can modify the analogy a little bit to say he made a bunch of coconut smoothies out of the coconuts. So he didn't just make first use of them, he also put his work into them. If you want to stick very close to the Lockean interpretation of property rights. Now that we've established that, and that's out of the way, you can say that that is his property. Now the question becomes, does the person with the property have a positive obligation to the other person to give them that property to save their life, right? If they refuse to suck the dick, do they have to give the property anyway? So they have to give the coconuts or the coconut smoothie out of positive obligation. And to me, the answer is no. And the reason for that is because it isn't universalizable. Now, I told you that this was going to be a little bit of a complicated answer to this that requires a lot of different things, which again is one of the reasons why I don't blame most of these people for not being able to what I feel like is adequately answer this on Vaush's show. And universalizability is a product of rationality. You can do more reading on it on Kant, but essentially the idea is that any sort of moral rule that you were to put into place must be applicable at all times, in all places, by all people, if we are all equal moral actors, right? If there is someone who is of moral superiority and therefore like a natural born tyrant, then they wouldn't apply to this universalizability principle, i.e. something like a god, essentially, would not have to make a universalizable rule that also applied to itself because it transcends all of that. But we don't live in that world, or at least we don't directly interact with that world, whichever your preference is. So we need to construct rules, if we are to be rationally sound, that are universalizable. And one of the ways that property rights establishes this is it doesn't make positive obligations for other people. When you have property, it is your property and you get to do with it as you see fit and nothing else. This is the only way it can be universalizable. Otherwise, and this is just by product of scarcity, you will run into a situation inevitably where you can no longer distribute those resources without doing equal harm to the person who owns the property as to the person who's receiving it. Now, we can stack any number of arbitrary claims in between there to try to craft some super scenario, but again, this is an assertion of arbitrariness, which is an issue if you're trying to make a rationally coherent argument. So, to quickly sum all of that up, the person is not obligated to give you, the survivor, any of their coconuts without some sort of exchange, because by compulsion of universalizability, property rights can't be constructed in a way that also includes a caveat of you having a positive obligation to another person access to that property. Now, I understand this is not a feel-good answer. Like, it sucks, right? Like, nobody wants to hear that be what I believe to be the correct answer, because it's unfortunate that the person is put into this position. I don't think it's very nice, but at the same time, I can't come up with any sort of morally sound argument that would suggest that it is immoral, right? That this coercion, which again is used to imply immoral, that the action of denying that person the coconuts is immoral. Could that person die? Yes. Is that tragic? Yes. Is it immoral? I don't think it can be. I don't think it can be without inserting other arbitrary distinctions along the way that either break universalizability, break property rights, which exists as a system to help maintain that balance of scarcity, to help maintain that universalizability, like I talked about earlier, and essentially just eschew the whole process of logic and rationalization to begin with. Now, from the perspective of Vaush, this act is immoral because it would deny someone their life and therefore the liberties of living. Now that may sound a little strange to some of you who come from my audience, for example, but it's not really that difficult to conceptualize, right? If you are dead, you are the least free you can possibly be. You're done, game over. Your only option is to be dead at that point. So if your goal is maximizing positive liberties, which is the case of Vaush, or at least so he claims is an axiomatic portion of his moral framework, then to do so, you must allow that person to take or to have the coconuts, regardless of the request made by the person who owns the property. It doesn't matter even if they own the property. It doesn't matter if you take into detail any of these property considerations, because the claim has been made that positive liberties are the most important thing that should be maintained within reason, which is not something that I'm going to get into in this because I don't feel like it's important to Vaush's argument, even though I feel like it adds a little bit of arbitrariness into it. Now that we've established these 2 points, I think it becomes pretty clear to see why the issue is really difficult to argue from the perspective of a pro-property rights capitalist or something like that. Because if you were to say that this is coercion, then that means, or immoral, whichever you'd like to use, then that means that essentially any exchange between people on a hierarchy of scarce resources is coercive, is immoral. It doesn't matter if the person will die tomorrow or the day after or the day after that. You denying that to that person limits their positive freedoms, their positive liberties. So and if those things were to exist, that's not disputable, right? Like whatever these positive liberties are, whatever you want to imagine them as, whatever spectrum you want to put them on, like that's kind of undeniable. The question is whether these things are of moral consideration. So it's a much easier argument to say, I don't think the person should die. That's wrong. They'd be a hell of a lot less free if they were dead. A hell of a lot less free. And as people who typically care about liberty, that's a pretty compelling argument, honestly, especially on a surface level. If you're someone who cares about positive freedoms, then that's a super compelling argument. If you're someone who believes they're of moral consideration, that's a super compelling argument. Being dead is the ultimate removal of those things. Now that I've taken the time to go through both of these perspectives, something that I wanted to add is what the implications of these two systems are, right? So the two perspectives of looking at this, from negative liberties and positive liberties and all these other terms, universalizability, property, blah, 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 blah. What does it mean at the end if you were to apply this across everything? If you were to apply it universally, right? Essentially, this would mean, because the act is immoral, that the individual is justified in using violence to take the coconuts. And theoretically, because the price is their own life, up to death. So what have we done? We've exchanged a life for a life. The reason that I think this analogy is kind of unproductive, if you take it to that logical end, is because whenever you put yourself into a situation where you're trading a life for a life, it makes the perceived moral high ground a lot grayer. Because let's play it out, right? So you want the coconut, they ask you to suck your dick, you say no, you go to take the coconut, and they shove you. Okay? So you have the option of not taking the coconut or trying to take the coconut again. You take the coconut again, he shoves you again. He stands in the way of the coconut. Now you have to get through him to get the coconuts. You still believe that you're morally superior in this case because you're taking the coconuts, right? And then you shove him, knock him over, and take the coconut. You guys brawl. Eventually he grabs a coconut, tries to hit you over the head with it. You respond, hit him with the coconut. He's dead. Congratulations. Now you have all the coconuts, and he's died. You've traded a life for a life, and you're in the exact same point. So I don't even think from a utilitarian perspective, if you were to play it out, anyone's really won. Now, the purpose of this analogy is to draw it out into larger society, right? I feel like that's pretty obvious. It's supposed to compare people in a hierarchy of scarce goods to one another. So I have lots of money. You want a job. I say, okay, you have to work 80 hours a week to get X amount of money. And then that's how you get it, right? And you need that money to survive. You don't necessarily need my money, but you need money. And all of the money is owned by somebody, right? At least all of it that's in circulation. That's what that basically means. Somebody owns it somewhere. So because of what I talked about earlier with like universalizability, we run into an issue with every single scarce resource where essentially it's going to come down to somebody needs this thing to survive and they offer you an exchange for it. And if you say no and either take it anyways, which would be something that is advocated a lot of times, or act in a manner that would in some way remove that property from that person, you're essentially dooming them to the same fate as yourself. It inevitably must happen. And when you are swapping positions like this on this hierarchy of scarcity, it no longer becomes as clean cut of a moral issue for the what I would consider Vaush's position of positive liberties. It makes it quite messy, actually. And not to say that someone being damned to the fate of not having the scarce resources they need to survive is better optically, but it puts them on the same sort of playing field. It just takes more steps to get there. So there's like a layer of obfuscation to where the answer requires significantly more depth to appropriately address from the perspective of pro-property rights or pro-capitalism, or however you want to look at it, than it does from the perspective of the anti-property rights, essentially. And it also takes more examination to get to the same kind of crappy end. So it's really a clever construction. It's very rhetorically effective, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to take some time to look at it. And so to deconstruct this question, this analogy, this gotcha almost, you have to do a lot of groundwork to get there. So it's something that I didn't want to spend too much time on. I think this video is already getting a little longer than I planned, and I hope I did a decent-ish job of giving an answer. Now, Vaush would have had any number of issues along the way with what I had said, whether it be universalizability, or property rights, or the applications, or scarcity, yada yada. I'm sure anywhere along the way he would have stopped me and said, hey, well, let's talk about this for a second. But unfortunately, he's not here to do that. So I figured I'd just give you both sides of the conversation and let you make your own determination on it. Because I don't feel like this is something that's gotten a good answer. And to many of you, maybe this isn't a good answer, but I do think it's the most correct answer. These systems are the way they are because they must be that way in order to rationally follow. And if rationality isn't something you care about, well then, hey, Hume's law, I can't make you care about it. No one can. No one can make you care about any of this. And the same thing goes for positive liberties, if those are to be the case. So again, this question fundamentally comes down to where you stand on the line of positive versus negative liberties, right? Do you think that positive liberties are something of moral consideration, or do you think negative liberties are something of moral consideration? If you'd like for me to do an entire segment or video just on what the difference between those two things are and why I think one follows and one does not, go ahead, drop a comment in this video and let me know. I'll be sure to add it to the list of content that I want to make here in the near future. But that's all I've got for you guys. I hope you have an awesome rest of your day and take it easy.